Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jakub Zajaczkowski. I'm from Faculty of Political Science and International Studies, Department of Area and Global Studies, and I'm very happy that we could meet today and discuss on Indo-Pacific great power politics in Indo-Pacific. I think it is consensus among scholars that Indo-Pacific is an area which has become more and more important in not only in geopolitics but also in geoeconomics in the last 10-15 years. It is a place of not only of cooperation but more and more of competition between great powers. I think it is also consensus among scholars that, especially in the security field, we don't have multilateral institutions in Indo-Pacific which could be responsible for security. So still power politics, great power politics are very important factor in shaping IR in Indo-Pacific. And today we would like to discuss on all this issue, especially also in the context of last 2-3 years. We could see a lot of new elements, new factors which could have impact on strategy of great power, middle powers in Indo-Pacific. What will happen in post-COVID period? How great power politics will shape, especially in the context of last events in Afghanistan, and more factors, elements we would like to put during today's discussion, because it is a very complex situation in Indo-Pacific. But I think we could agree that in next years and today and in next years, strategies of powers, great powers, middle powers will have decisive will be decisive in coming years still. So that's why I'm very happy that today we could discuss with about all this issue with distinguished professors, friends, colleagues who accept the invitation to take part in this seminar. Professor Edward Haliżak from our Faculty of Political Science and International Studies, Department of Area and Global Studies. He's a president of Polish Association of International Studies. Professor Roberto Rabel from Victoria University of Willington. Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, the rector of Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Shantanu Chakrabarti from University of Calcutta. Professor Stephen Nagy from International Christian University. Professor Raymond Kwun-Sun from Department of Political Science and Sociology, North-South University, and Yumel Estranero from Office of the President and the Lyceum of the Philippines. So very nice to meet you. And I think the discussion debate is the most important. So I would like to ask each panelist to present the most important points. 11 minutes. So we'll have later about 40 minutes for questions, answers, discussion. So let's start from Professor Haliżak. I don't know if he joined us already, Professor Haliżak. Yes, so Professor Haliżak, 10, 11 minutes, so the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome our friends from all over the world and mainly from the Asia Pacific region. So thank you for an invitation to discuss such an important topic, which is very actual and which is very actual and of great importance. Let me start from a short comment based on an observation of current development in Afghanistan. First, Afghanistan case show the total ineffectiveness of the military force in foreign policy. The second, China is very happy of this, support its long-term view that United States is in decline process. And for Chinese scholars, as I know, this is evident empirical, support of their thesis. My short presentation is titled "The False Promise of Cold War Analogy in Great Power Politics in the Indo-Pacific Region." The false promise of Cold War analogy in great power politics in the Indo-Pacific region. There are a growing number of scholars as well as governmental officials who argue that the new Cold War just emerging in Indo-Pacific region. It's because since Donald Trump era, the United States started to recognize China as an existential threat to its security. And to the United Order. This claim resembles much the U.S. attitude during the Cold War and attitude toward the Soviet Union. Generally, the United States approach to China became more and more ideological. United States strategy is aimed at isolating China, ousting China from value-added global chain production, slowing down China's economic growth, and drawing China into arms race. And last but not least, trying to marginalize China in international affairs in the region. So all these things, make assumption that a bipolar system is emerging in Asia Pacific. We are witnessing the emergence of a new bipolarism. This thesis is also supported by the distribution of power and especially economy. China now accounts around 16% share in global GDP, and the United States comparatively around 23.5%. So the gap is narrowing, and there are many who argue that within a decade, China will be a #1 in the world economy. So the economic, in terms of economic power, China will be on the par with the United States. So the basic question is, what is the basic feature of this new emerging bipolar structure? I argue that this new bipolar structure has a loose character. This is the loose bipolar structure, according to the Morton Kaplan model. In the 50s, he published a famous monograph on a international system, where he distinguished between tight bipolar system and loose bipolar system. Tight bipolar system was characterized by the present in why. What are the arguments support my claim that this is the loose bipolar system? Because the absence of formalized antagonistic coalition. United States as well as China has not yet arranged two opposite antagonistic coalition in the region. The so-called Quad initiative do not fulfill the criteria of antagonistic coalition aimed against China. Three key US allies, Japan, Republic of Korea, and Australia, share US apprehension over China, but they are not interested in implementing Cold War strategy due to the economic links with China. This is especially important in the case of Japan and the Republic of Korea. As far as another regional power, India has a deep-rooted differences with Beijing, but not interested in China containment. If we follow the official statement and assumption of India's strategy, this South Asia power is not interested in containment, rather in balancing. In balancing. As far as China concerned, China has not established formal anti-US coalition. China is a lone superpower. North Korea is a burden for China, is not any assets. Many argue that China has an alliance with Russia. It doesn't true. Russia is not ally of China. Rather, Russia is very suspicious of China intention and the unresolved territorial claim, historical reason. Generally speaking, the United States strategy based on Stephen Walt's balance of threat theory. United States tried to present the threat for the region or for the United States from China. So the United States will switch to the balance of threat theory. And in my opinion, this strategy has not been enough successful because the failure to create formal anti-Chinese alliance in the region, because other powers, regional powers, do not share totally the U.S. view of existential threat from China.
Professor Haliżak, so 30 seconds.
It is happening because China do not arranging in anti-West, anti-US formal coalition. Okay, arrange a formal anti-US coalition. Open trade and investment regional system, paradoxically, important part of the liberal order. And the speech of Xi Jinping in Bao Forum in this year and in Davos 4 years ago support my view. Dilemma in the region is very weak, leaving a large room for a cooperation at many institutional level. And in this situation, I am finishing. Third countries are not compelled to choose between balancing or bandwagoning, and instead of this, they follow hedging strategy. The best example of this is Vietnam. Vietnam, also to some extent India. So this is the hedging strategy, in my opinion, is the best characterization of great power politics in Asia Pacific, in Indo-Pacific region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Haliżak, also for time discipline. And now we are moving from Poland, Warsaw, we are moving to New Zealand, Wellington. Professor Roberto Rabel from Center for Strategic Studies, Victoria University of Wellington. Professor, screen is yours. Also 11 minutes.
Thank you, Professor Zajaczkowski. It's a great pleasure to be here on this distinguished panel, and I'm delighted to be able to join everyone from New Zealand this evening. Professor Haliżak ended on that note about hedging, and I'd like to look at how one small liberal democracy in the Southwest Pacific is doing some of that hedging. As we know, all the states in the region are affected by the shifting geopolitics that is going on in the region, especially the Sino-American competition that Professor Haliżak alluded to. And my task is to talk about how New Zealand is responding to that geopolitical competition as a kind of case study. And I'm going to talk basically about three themes. The first one is New Zealand's Asia-Pacific sweet spot. And I'll explain what I mean by that as I go through. The second one is how the changing geopolitics of the region, especially that Sino-US competition, has disturbed New Zealand's previous happy space in the region, and how New Zealand is responding to that. And thirdly, I want to offer some thoughts about why New Zealand has responded as it has in very recent times. First, let me say something about that Asia-Pacific sweet spot of New Zealand. Essentially, over the past couple of decades or so, New Zealand has benefited immensely from the evolution of the Asia-Pacific as a zone of peace and prosperity. And New Zealand has benefited enormously from the dynamism of the region. That dynamism being driven in part by Chinese economic growth, but also underpinned by the provision of the international public good of international security by the United States, and also underpinned by the centrality of ASEAN in regional architecture. And New Zealand's been a very active and engaged actor in that Asian Pacific regional architecture. It's especially interested in deeper economic integration in the region, is an enthusiastic member of RCEP, and was one of the progenitors of what has become the CPTPP from its original origins way back in time as a small grouping known as the P4 between New Zealand, Chile, Brunei, and Singapore. As an Asia-Pacific actor, New Zealand has also enjoyed excellent relations with both China and the United States. And let me just say something about both of those relationships. Some of you, if not all of you, will know that New Zealand had a rupture in its relationship with the United States in the 1980s, when New Zealand and the United States fell out over visits of nuclear-armed and powered ships to New Zealand ports, as a result of which the United States suspended its Anzus guarantee of security to New Zealand. But as liberal democracies, the United States and New Zealand have found ways of compartmentalizing that particular difference, and relations between the two countries have grown much closer once again over the course of the 21st century. And although New Zealand is still not back in Anzus and has no intention of doing that, its relationship with the United States is almost as close as it were. Some of you may also be aware that in a few days' time, it will be the 70th anniversary of the Anzus Treaty being signed in 1951 in San Francisco. And there was recently a bipartisan resolution in the US Senate, which very much extolled the virtues of Australia as an ally, but was almost as fulsome in its praise about New Zealand as a long-standing partner of the United States. So New Zealand and the United States have very much been reconciled in the past decade or so. But while it's enjoyed that good relationship with the United States, New Zealand has also had a very good relationship with China. China's been very much a good news story for New Zealand. Since 2008, when New Zealand was the first developed country to sign a free trade agreement with China, Chinese and New Zealand leaders have often talked about a series of firsts in the relationship between China and New Zealand. And it's been commented often that China kind of used New Zealand as a testing ground for its relationship with other Western democracies as well. And over the course of the past 20 years, China has become New Zealand's most important trading partner. The political relationship was a very good one. And there has been, over that period, much talk for many years of a win-win relationship with an awful lot of respect. So that was essentially New Zealand's Asia-Pacific sweet spot, that New Zealand benefited from the evolution of the Asia-Pacific as an increasingly integrated region with institutions such as APEC and more recently the CPTPP, with all the ASEAN-centered regional architecture. And New Zealand leaders very much like the fact that they can go to the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, and they can sit alongside both the great and small, and everyone has an equal voice at the table. And that Asia-Pacific set of relationships very much suited New Zealand. Over the past 2 to 4 years, that has become much more difficult. That utopia of the Asia-Pacific has shifted considerably, and a very different region has loomed in the shape of the Indo-Pacific. And that brings me to my second theme about how great power politics, especially that Sino-US competition, has disrupted New Zealand's happy place and how New Zealand's responding to that. As the notion of an Indo-Pacific region began to be championed by Japan, by Australia, and then by the Trump administration, New Zealand was very wary of buying into that concept and adopting that nomenclature. It was very worried about the perceived geopolitical connotations that this was an attempt to contain China. And in this respect, it also was very similar to ASEAN. But once ASEAN issued its ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific in 2019, I should say, that has tended to provide some cover for New Zealand in terms of beginning to embrace that notion. And like ASEAN, New Zealand puts a lot of emphasis on words like inclusive with respect to the Indo-Pacific. And those words do a lot more heavy lifting for New Zealand than words like free and open, at least until recently. So New Zealand has very much in the past 2 to 3 years moved from using the Asia-Pacific language to embracing the language of the Indo-Pacific. And it's increasingly used in official documents. And there's a bit of mixing of the terms in New Zealand, especially in a year when New Zealand is hosting APEC. But, and also New Zealand has been careful in adopting this language in not to be too specific about what the Indo-Pacific constitutes and to be careful about what it means in terms of China relationship. But in the past 18 months or so, things have begun to shift more decisively. And not only has New Zealand more enthusiastically embraced the idea of the Indo-Pacific, but it's also been seen to be moving closer to the United States, having tried to keep a measured distance between the United States and China. And this really stands out in some ways, because as recently as even this year, some commentators in the UK, in Australia, and even the United States, usually conservative media, have suggested that New Zealand is a soft underbelly of the Five Eyes intelligence arrangement, and that New Zealand is too soft on China. And occasionally, some of our politicians have provided fodder for those views. For instance, our trade minister about a year ago was asked about why the relationship between China and Australia was so bad, and he suggested that Australia needed to show more respect to China like New Zealand did. His predecessor in an earlier government as trade minister referred to the facilities in which so many Uyghurs have been incarcerated as educational facilities. And so this has led to these comments in conservative media, particularly that New Zealand is a kind of appeaser of China. But over the last 12 months, it's very difficult to make that charge. And there's been a notable shift in tone. And the kinds of statements that New Zealand government has made are increasingly in line with those made by the United States and New Zealand's other Five Eyes partners. And for instance, just last month, our Prime Minister gave a keynote foreign policy address at the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs conference. She spoke about the Indo-Pacific, and in speaking about the Indo-Pacific and New Zealand's acceptance of that as what she called our home region, rather than using the term Asia-Pacific, in speaking about that, she ended her speech on the note of wishing for a freer and more open Pacific. You couldn't have asked for something that would be more music to American ears than her speech. As I say, it's less than a month ago. At that same conference, immediately after her speech, the conference organizers beamed in Kurt Campbell, who is well known as the Biden administration's Asia czar, and he was very, very eloquent in describing how close the New Zealand and American relationship was, and full of praise for New Zealand in his comments. So New Zealand does seem to be shifting in its positioning and in the kind of hedging that has been doing. New Zealand is not keen on choosing between China and the United States, in part because it is very conscious of the economic benefit of its relationship with China and the
Professor,
political links with the United States.
Seconds.
Okay, thank you. My third theme is why this has happened. And there are three possible reasons. One is that it's a proactive decision by New Zealand, a kind of reflection of its independent foreign policy. It's due to US behavior, or it's due to Chinese behavior. And I would say there's a bit of all those elements, but no one in Wellington has proactively sat down and said that we need to be firmer in our position in China and try and jeopardize our relationship with our greatest trading partner. Nor have they really been affected that much by American behavior, because American behavior, notwithstanding the fireworks of the Trump administration and all the bluster that accompany the free and open Indo-Pacific idea, there has been essential continuity through three administrations as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. So it hasn't been too much due to American pressure, although New Zealand is more comfortable with the Biden administration than the Trump administration. Essentially, this has been a response to Chinese behavior. And whether it's internal behavior of increasing authoritarianism, of behavior in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, etc., or responses to what is happening in the South. Essentially, as a liberal democracy, New Zealand has felt pressed to comment along the same lines as some other liberal democracies in the Asia Pacific. So what New Zealand is now finding is that as it shifts from that Asia Pacific sweet spot to trying to navigate the waters of the Indo-Pacific, it's going to find the times somewhat more challenging. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. And let's move now from New Zealand to Delhi, Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, the Rector of Jawaharlal Nehru University. So Chintamani, screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Jakub, Zajaczkowski, the chair of the session. Ladies and gentlemen, all of us in the world are living in an era of strategic uncertainty right now. We can see very clear clash of values at the moment, maybe partly because of the pandemic, values of nationalism and internationalism. And of course, there is also a very clear-cut clash of liberal worldview and realist worldview. Now, in this presentation, I'll basically talk about a few things. Number one, who are the actors in the great power politics in the Indo-Pacific? Number two, what are the drivers of great power politics? Number three, what are the major current strategic developments in the region? And finally, I'll try to give my own prognostications about the future, very near future. Now, in my view, the United States, China, Japan are the major powers, great powers. They're the real actors. But these actors alone cannot do anything without cooperation or competition involving India, Australia, South Korea, and a united ASEAN if we are going to see in the future, united ASEAN on strategic issues. There are basically 5 major drivers of great power politics in the Indo-Pacific. Number one, the US and China rivalry for influence in the region. Number two, efforts by Japan, India, Vietnam, and the Philippines to restrain the Chinese maritime and territorial expansionism. Number three, efforts by Quad members to restrain the Chinese ambition to achieve regional hegemony. And number four, efforts by the ASEAN countries to press ahead its relevance and centrality in the face of rising Chinese influence and new political games arising out of Indo-Pacific geopolitical dynamics. And finally, continuing efforts by Japan and South Korea to handle the complicated nuclear issues in the Korean Peninsula. So these are the main drivers of the great power politics, but the current developments taking place in the region, most of you are observing what is going on, are important to understand the politics in this region. Number one, the US has lost considerable trust among its allies in recent years, partly because of Trump's approach towards allies, and more recently because of the hasty and inadequate planning by the Biden administration to wind up military operations in Afghanistan. Number two, Trump's America First policy reduced the priority given to the alliance partners by America. And now Biden's America is back slogan is really indicating that it is back to nation building at home and some kind of retrenchment from engagement in different parts of the world. Number three, Trump walked away from TPP, and Joe Biden had shown no interest to enter the CCTPP. Number four, Trump stayed away from Asian multilateralism, and Biden has given focus only to Quad. Number five, Kamala Harris' recent trip to Singapore and Vietnam has not energized American engagement in the region enough to counter the Chinese inroads into regional influence in recent years. Number six, China is a net gainer of loss of US influence and reduction of US engagements in the Indo-Pacific. Number seven, Chinese expansionism continues despite the discourses against BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, and the predatory economic practices of China, as the BRI partners have no alternatives. And the pandemic-induced economic challenges have really made them more vulnerable and weaker. Number eight, China has strengthened its friendship with de facto nuclear powers in the Indo-Pacific, such as North Korea, Pakistan, and prospective nuclear powers such as Iran. The United States has no leverage over North Korea. It has lost its leverage over Pakistan, particularly after withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, and there is zero positive leverage over Iran right now. Number nine, energy independence of the United States has actually led to more dependence of the energy-rich countries in the periphery of the Indo-Pacific. Those are the Gulf countries, who are now more dependent on markets in the Indo-Pacific, particularly China. And finally, the way the United States has handled the pandemic has not inspired any country. The way China has managed its pandemic, including continuing economic muscle power, has frightened many countries in the Indo-Pacific. There are many developments, but I think these 10 important developments have to be factored when we try to decipher and understand great power politics in Indo-Pacific. My final point would be a little bit about the future, not as an astrologer, but as a student of this region, how I look at the near future. Number one, the US will find it very hard to restore its credibility as a reliable ally or strategic partner during the periods of strategic distress in the Indo-Pacific region, which is already there. Number two, the economic Cold War launched by the Trump administration against China and continued by the Biden administration has had no negative impact on the overall US-China trade and investment relationship. Side by side, what Australia lost in export earnings vis-a-vis China, the American companies have gained, including the beef and coal and so many other items. Number three, the US government stand against the Confucius Institutes in various US universities has affected the budget of the American universities only. And the Chinese students continue to be the single largest group of foreign students in the USA. And this particular fact sends a clear message across to the allies and partner countries in the Indo-Pacific. Number four, while many American allies and partners have landed up in a dilemma due to the public display of Sino-US tensions and find it very difficult to take sides, many countries would not resort to non-alignment, would not resort to non-alignment, and many would rather like to reap the benefits from trading with China and seeking strategic ties with the USA. And this particular fact that I'm stating is going to complicate both politics and the relationship in the Indo-Pacific region. Number five, Quad in order to become successful, has to come up with a clear set of goals. It has to add associate members and observers and seek win-win strategies to remain relevant. Only making containment of China the goal, although it is unstated, will go nowhere. And sixth, whether Biden administration will come up with another fancy doctrine like the ones pivot to Asia rebalancing remains a question mark now. And let me make it very clear that in my understanding, countries in the Indo-Pacific region have absolutely no appetite for Cold War. And in this situation, the role of the European Union in the Indo-Pacific will be critical in the near future. Thank you very much, Jakub, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation and also for time discipline. It was perfect, 10 minutes. So let's go now from Delhi to Calcutta. Professor Shantanu Chakrabarti from University of Calcutta will focus now on India.
Thank you, Professor Jajaczkowski. Let me begin by first thanking the organizers for giving me this chance to share some of my thoughts. My three co-panelists have already made quite comprehensive presentations, so I would stick myself to highlight in highlighting 2 or 3 points which point out the rather confusing nature surrounding the region itself. First of all, if you look at this transformation within policymaking circles regarding how to conceptualizing this entire region, whether to call it Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific. Now, we know that when the gradual transformation of Asia Pacific into Indo-Pacific slowly crept in within US policymaking circles, particularly during the Trump administration, it was criticized by both China as a pro-US view trying to circle China. It was also criticized by a lot of scholars as something which was being conceived by US policymakers primarily on strategic terms, in militaristic terms. And if you look at the outcome in the sense of trying to build various military alliances, trying to develop the Quad into a more solidified organization, all these were referred to as being parts of the same plan, trying to surround China. Now, if Asia Pacific, however, people who favored the term Indo-Pacific was started highlighting the essential integral nature, the integral process, the historical connectivity, the linkages between the two oceanic systems, the Pacific and the Indian Oceanic systems, the historical linkage, cultural connectivity, and all that. However, one could mention here that even if you look at the term Indo-Pacific, this is not the first time this was being used. And very curiously speaking, even when you look at the specific term Indo-Pacific, just like the term is being used now in American policymaking circles, when Indo-Pacific, the specific term was beginning to be utilized, it was also essentially thought of within strategic making circles. I am reminded of an excellent article which came out recently by an Harvard-based scholar, Hang-Song Lee. His article's title is Intellectual Origins of Indo-Pacific as a term. And he refers to Karl Hochhofer, the famous German geographer, and often considered to be one of the pioneers of geostrategic conceptualization. And he refers to Haushofer's work. Now, most of us who have looked at Haushofer knows to what extent his ideas were borrowed and were utilized by Japan within in Asia Pacific during 1930s and early 1940s. But in this article, this scholar highlights the fact that how Karl Haushofer thought of using the term Indo-Pacific in a more specific context. He was projecting it as anti-colonial. By anti-colonial, he essentially meant he was targeting the perceived Anglo-American domination over the Asia Pacific, and perhaps trying to find a way forward for the Germans to get more and more involved here, along with collaborators from different parts of the Asia Pacific. In case of he was negotiating, he had a large number of Indian collaborators, scholars who were residing there. Offhand, I could mention at least two, Taraknath Das and Binoy Kumar Sarkar, who also were trying to project a vision, an Indic vision, which was quite different to what K.M. Panikkar would project sitting here in India, because that was, Binoy Kumar Sarkar's writing, who had spent, and Taraknath Das, people who lived for a long time in Europe and United States, were more conversant with these geopolitical ideas, and where their theorization, their theoretical articles regarding why Indo-Pacific is a better integrated world, which was ruptured by the Anglo-Americans when they have come in, and it was time to revert back to that old space. So what I'm trying to say is Indo-Pacific, whatever, however better it might be than the term than the term Asia Pacific, did not escape strategic configurations when it was first being used. So as a result of which, when you see current level of confusions, Indo-Pacific, for instance, there is no general acceptance. I mean, Trump administration understood it in a specific manner. I don't know what Biden administration and how it tries to understand it. If you look at various ASEAN countries in various ASEAN forums, so when they have discussed, when they have issued policy statements, they are somewhat wary of this term, Indo-Pacific. If you look at European Union, I think among European Union countries today, only France has specifically accepted the term Indo-Pacific. The French president, for instance, while on a tour in Australia and New Zealand, at the Garden Island Naval Base lecture delivered in 2018, for instance, in connection to speaking about French involvement with Indo-Pacific world, he specifically said, I quote, the French policy in this world would be to have an inclusive and stabilizing mediating power, trying to project France as an inclusive and stabilizing mediating power. European Union, I would say, still do not really have any clear, and it's perhaps, it was perhaps natural, because given the ties with China, given the Chinese economic, the economic involvement, China's emergence as a global power, it's difficult really to see either any country within Asia Pacific can completely accept the American originated version of Indo-Pacific. They might accept Indo-Pacific, but it cannot be the strategic version which was being projected by the United States so far. About the future, Professor Mahapatra has already highlighted in a quite an extensive manner. But I would argue that there are two ways in which Indo-Pacific world might get affected in the coming decades. First of all, if you look at, if you prepare yourself for the worst scenario, that it's essentially going to be a very violent region with various sorts of internal conflicts spilling over across the borders because of the nature of connectivity itself, it might lead to a rise of what has been termed in another occasion as various strategic enclaves. That is, you have a sea of unrest in the region. You also have areas of areas where you do have a degree of stabilization and growth. This has been referred to by various IS scholars as strategic enclaves in essentially very unsecured regions. And the idea of the great powers would be to preserve, because primarily of economic and strategic motives, to preserve and control these sort of strategic enclaves. Now, with the American example in Afghanistan very recently, I think in the times to come, you will see increasing American reluctance to really put boots on the ground. That is, no official deployment of armies anymore. And if United States does that, I'm sure UK as well as European Union members are going to follow suit. As a result of, but if you do want to keep your strategic enclaves, I think
so Professor Shantanu, last minute.
Okay. Yes, I will wrap up. So my hunch is that in the coming decades, at least for next 10 to 20 years, just like during 1990s in the immediate end of Cold War, you would see a privatized, you would once again see proliferation of private military and security companies globally. And the great powers, particularly United States as well as powers of European Union, would be employing more and more private security companies here. In United States, there is a specific policy being followed. The current defense secretary in Biden's administration, for instance, comes with that sort of a background. He was CEO of a very big private security organization. There are several members within Biden's administration who also have that sort of a background. Even in case of China, just to give you one example, right in 2013, when Belt and Road Initiative was announced, China had nearly 4.3 million men and around 4,000 private security companies already. The numbers have proliferated, right now. And you increasingly have a collaboration. For instance, Eric Prince, the great creator of private security companies like Blackwater and DNCorp, now, for instance, is collaborating with several Chinese companies through a Hong Kong-based association called Frontier Services Group, which has been set up in Hong Kong. And Eric Prince, he denies that he is personally involved, but he is only acting in the capacity of an advisor. So that's one version of the Indo-Pacific. But even if there are troubles, and it looks like it's going to be a very troublesome world, you would have great powers trying to maintain these sort of strategic enclaves, primarily not through their official armies, but through greater involvement of these sort of private security companies. The second point, and I will end in 30 seconds, is that, how do you really judge who are great powers? Since 1990s, you have another conceptualization popularized by a scholar, Simon Unhold, and he created this concept of nation branding. The Nation Brand Index, which comes out with a ranking of nations, 50 biggest nation states, are, and if you look at that annual report, it's showing increasing and interesting changes in last 2-3 years. For instance, if you look at the 2020 report, the US has been pushed back to 10th position. India is 34th. Australia is 8th. New Zealand is 12th. I mean, I'm talking mostly of members belonging to the Quad group, and Japan has the position of 4th, whereas China, which was running steady throughout 2013 till 2019 at around 22nd or 23rd
Okay,
position, has been
Professor,
pushed back
last
to
10 seconds.
35th. So that's so on the one hand, you would have, if you look at non-statist conceptualization of state power and projection and what is it doing with that sort of power, that's what nation branding essentially talks of. And if you look at its branding of so-called great powers operating in the Indo-Pacific region, you have interesting twists and turns. New powers are arising, older powers are declining. And
it is the end, yes?
Yes, and the second is, my hunch is that within that context, it's not that the older powers are going to leave the field in a hurry. But it's essentially going to be a very conflictual world, and you would have increasing use of all sorts of non-state actors, including private security companies, in various Indo-Pacific zones of power.
Thank you very much, Professor. So sorry for putting pressure on the time, but as I said, we would like also to have about 30 minutes, 40 minutes for discussion debate. So thank you very much, Professor Chakrabarti, and let's go now from Calcutta to Tokyo, Professor Stephen Nagy from International Christian University, and big request, 10 minutes, because we would like to have, we have still 2 more speakers.
Thank you very much, Jacob.
So, Stephen, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and thank you very much to our speakers and our organizers. I'd like to frame my comments in terms of 3 broad comments. The first comment is framing competition. The second is what I would consider key actors in thinking about great power competition in the Indo-Pacific. And third, thinking about constraints. And the constraints that I'm going to focus on are structural constraints, and normative constraints. So in terms of framing the competition, I think it's really important for us to understand what is the competition in the Indo-Pacific between, and I think that we can understand this as rules of order. We have competition in terms of technology standards, in terms of maritime environment, in terms of international law, in terms of institutions. What's clear is that our Chinese friends are a revisionist power within the region. They are eschewing international law, and they are interested in reshaping the Indo-Pacific so it favors Chinese security concerns. This isn't a judgment on their behavior. It is an analytical observation of what they're doing. And I think this is very clear. And this leads to my second question, is competition between who? And I think it's very, it's naive to frame this competition between, only between China and the United States. The United States led order is supported not only by so-called Western powers, whether it's the EU or Australia or New Zealand. We should be very clear that the current order is the preferred order by Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. I would argue the EU's adoption of Indo-Pacific vision, the Netherlands' view of an Indo-Pacific vision, the Germans adopting Indo-Pacific guidelines, the French with their own free Indo-Pacific vision, are all indicative that these countries and regions prioritize a rules-based order within the region. And that if you read through their Indo-Pacific strategies and visions and guidelines, what's very clear is that they mention that they're concerned about the rules-based order challenge that China is presenting in all areas: technology, maritime environment, international law, and institutions. So competition between who, it's an oversimplification to think about this only between the United States and China. Rather, it is a competition between China and the less rules-based order, or a Chinese a rules-based order versus, I think, a U.S. supported or led order, which is broadly supported by not only Western countries, but also emerging countries. And I think that is a very important distinction. Second, the key actors, and this is related to a competition between who. It is an oversimplification only to focus on the United States and China in this so-called great power competition. My previous speakers mentioned Japan, but we should also think about Russia, India, the EU, Australia, and many other countries and regions who are very much interested in the evolution of this rules-based order. Arguably, countries within the Indo-Pacific, so-called littoral states of the Indo-Pacific, are interested in further institutionalizing trade, understanding how to behave within the region, and arguably they would like to have this done in a rule of law and transparent way. Now, how we understand this and how we understand great powers versus middle powers, I think it's clear to say that Japan is now moved to an understanding of itself as a middle power. Russia, I think, is perhaps a great power today, but it will definitely be a middle power tomorrow. India, I think, has huge latent capacities, but in reality, its behavior is more like a middle power. The EU as well, and other countries and regions. All of these middle powers are going to be very influential in shaping the behavior of both China and the United States. The United States, of course, would like to get their support for their activities, which means the United States engagement within the Indo-Pacific is going to have to be much more accommodating to the interests of the regions. And I'm going to come back to, I think, some important regions that I think the United States is going to have to court very actively to have a successful Indo-Pacific strategy moving forward. Constraints, and I think constraints are very, very important. Some of the speakers spoke about, I think, in terms of China's inevitability, in terms of the direction and its ability to compete with the United States. I think we should be very clear about the domestic constraints that China faces. Its demographic issue is going to impact its economic growth. In the next 5 years, it's going to have about 350 million elderly without a social welfare system to support. How does China manage this domestic challenge is very, very important. We see Xi Jinping shift towards the left, adopting neo-Maoist policies, putting curbs on technology, and inserting party secretariats into the private sector and state-owned enterprises. This will affect innovation. It will affect the dynamism of the economy, and it will slow economic growth. And arguably, China's greatest weapon in any kind of competition with the United States or others is its economic growth. There are real questions about the leftist turn under Xi Jinping, how this will affect economic dynamism, even though it's being sold as common prosperity. China's enormous environmental challenges, its lack of friends and alliance partners within the region are all significant constraints on China's ability to compete with the United States and many of the United States partners. And I think these are really important litmus tests and barometers for us to be thinking about the inevitability of China's rise and the inevitability of China to have a sustained hyper-competitive relationship with the United States. And I think that this is something that we need to consider very, very carefully when we're talking about great power politics within the Indo-Pacific. What about the United States? Is the United States competitivity inevitable? And here we have real challenges to the internal cohesion of the United States in terms of domestic politics. Whether we like it or not, 74 million people voted for Mr. Trump. We have individuals that are still saying that the election was stolen. The United States is a highly divided society, and that division percolates into the political environment, making it difficult to adopt the important competitive tools that it needs to compete with China. We're going to have an infrastructure plan next month under decision in the United States. Will the progressives be able to get on board an infrastructure plan? How will this, what will this mean if an infrastructure plan cannot move forward? What does this mean for the upcoming presidential and midterm elections? US cohesion is not inevitable either. It has huge challenges domestically, and this could affect its ability to compete with with China moving forward. Lastly, in terms of constraints, is the EU and ASEAN. And I know the EU, looking at what has happened in Afghanistan, is very concerned about the United States and its commitments and security commitments to the region. The EU has valued development and investment in places like Afghanistan in terms of human rights and promoting gender-related issues. For the EU, seeing the apparent quick withdrawal and chaotic withdrawal of the United States does raise questions about the United States. And they are also thinking about what is the sustainability of the Biden administration. Will he be able to withstand this punch in the gut in terms of popularity, and how will this impact the midterm elections and potentially his re-election? Lastly, and it goes back into this idea of buy-in. Will ASEAN buy into the Indo-Pacific strategy that's being sold by the United States? And there are real open questions to this. We've seen Japan tilt towards ASEAN and placing ASEAN centrality to the center of its free and open Indo-Pacific vision, but the United States as yet hasn't been successful in convincing ASEAN states that it is not asking ASEAN countries to choose between China and the United States. These last three constraints, I think, are very, very important considerations for us to think about great power politics in the Indo-Pacific moving forward. They raise the question: is the final destination of the Indo-Pacific actually going to be in the hands of China and the United States if they can't deal with their own domestic contradictions? I'll stop there as you gave me 10 minutes, Jakub, and I look forward to the dialogue. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you also for discipline. And let's go now to Professor Raymond Kwun-Sun from Department of Political Science and Sociology, North-South University. 10 minutes, Professor.
Can you? Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible and visible to you all?
Yes, yes,
okay.
Everything is okay.
Sure. So thank you very much, first of all, for Professor Jakub, for chairing this section, and also thank you for the organizer for inviting me to this very timely, important discussion. So what I would like to do is to share PowerPoint slides. Okay, so can everyone see the PowerPoint slides that I'm sharing at the moment?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so what I would like to do for the next 10 minutes, okay, is to share some of my preliminary observation relating to the US-China geopolitical competition in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative and the Indo-Pacific Strategy, okay, in the so-called post-COVID-19 world. I think central, okay, to this strategic competition, okay, between the US and China is these two very divergent viewpoints being advocated by President Donald Trump and the so-called Indo-Pacific Dream, okay, and the Chinese President Xi Jinping and the so-called Asia-Pacific Century. And the issue at stake here, okay, relating to these two very divergent viewpoints being shared by the two leaders, perhaps is the fact that both Washington and Beijing, okay, they have been trying to counterbalance the influence of each other in this region, whether it's being called the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific. And one of the major driving force, okay, behind these efforts of Washington and Beijing in terms of counterbalancing each other, perhaps, is the intensifying strategic competition, okay, between the two sides. While many Chinese scholars actually they do share the viewpoint that, okay, 2008 perhaps could be understood as the watershed moment, or this turning point in terms of the US-China relations. in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. So what I would like to do for today's presentation is, first of all, to make sense of this growing strategic distrust between US and China since 2008. Again, by strategic distrust, I'm referring to this mutual mistrust of the long-term intention between US and China. And second is I'm trying to make sense of this emerging prominence of assertive nationalism in China and what its implications for the Chinese foreign policy making as well as the country's relations with the US through a comparative study of the BRI and the Indo-Pacific Strategy. So two major arguments I'm trying to make here. First is that the overarching driving force of China's foreign policy is first and foremost is to demonstrate its so-called system self-confidence and the belief that China itself as a rising power can offer a so-called Chinese model of economic development as an alternative to the Western model for the world. And second is this offensive being initiated by the Chinese government under Xi Jinping to defend Beijing's national interests in a confrontational way, which is mainly driven by the assertive Chinese nationalism, and some term this as a wolf warrior diplomacy, has inevitably exacerbated strategic distrust between Beijing and Washington. Because of time constraints, so I'm trying to do 5 things, if time permits. First is to make sense of this growth of assertive nationalism and the relations with Chinese foreign policy making. And I'm also going to look into the Belt and Road Initiative and the Indo-Pacific Strategy, as well as the establishment of the so-called Quad, in order to understand this intensifying US strategic competition. So I'm also trying to offer some possible contributing factors leading to this intensifying strategic competition between the two sides. And finally, I'm trying to look into the implication, the interplay between this strategic competition between the two sides in the post COVID-19 world. Okay, so talking about the growth of assertive nationalism in China, I think what is important for us, first of all, to understand, is the China's growing assertiveness or China's growing confidence on the world stage under Xi Jinping. And in many ways, this could be understood as a radical departure of a fundamental departure of the 3-decade logic of so-called keeping a low profile under the former leader Deng Xiaoping. And central to understanding this fundamental departure of Chinese foreign policy making perhaps is Xi Jinping's his advocacy of his so-called China dream, with the national rejuvenation as being the core, as well as the advocacy of his so-called 4 confidence doctrine. So which is about confidence in the path, theory, system, and culture, of the so-called socialism with Chinese characteristics. And this growing sense of Beijing's self-confidence in the world stage, particularly since 2008, could be evidenced in some remarks on many occasions being made by the Chinese President Xi Jinping. For example, his advocacy of the so-called Chinese wisdom, Chinese approach as a new option for the world. And talking about this growth of assertive nationalism, and obviously, this term assertive nationalism is not my own invention, but in fact, 2 very important publications were being made in the 1980s, which have laid a very important foundation for this discussion and debate surrounding this relationship between the assertive nationalism and foreign policy making in China. One of the most important publications perhaps is Alan's writing back in 1983, in which he argues that the sense of this so-called assertive nationalism in China's foreign policy making is that Beijing's actions were well calculated, and it was able to manipulate nationalism to further its national interests during its negotiation with foreign countries. But at the same time, it will not allow nationalism to worsen its relations with great powers. So in terms of understanding, okay, this discussion and debate surrounding this relationship between Chinese nationalism and foreign policy making, three assumptions concerning Chinese nationalism are particularly important. Okay, assumption number one is the anti-Western orientation. The second is the state nationalism, which we understood is like a top-down nationalism being actively promoted by the Chinese Communist Party. And third is the so-called narrative, okay, being actively promoted as a century of shame and humiliation. So in terms of understanding, okay, this growing assertiveness of Chinese foreign policy making, perhaps the most important pillar underpinning this assertive Chinese foreign policy making, perhaps is the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy in recent years, like being advocated by the Chinese government under Xi Jinping. In many ways, as I argue, okay, this wolf warrior diplomacy could be understood as a logical extension of President Xi Jinping's his so-called four confidence doctrine, which could also be understood as the Chinese government's efforts, okay, to refute in the Chinese eyes the highly biased Western media portrayal of China in order to tell the true China story. So in this sense, seeing this from the Chinese government's perspective, the wolf warrior diplomacy is a direct response, okay, to the unfair approaches, especially US or other Western powers. So in this sense, okay, the launch of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, here could be understood in many ways as a demonstration of China's system's self-confidence. In fact, in many ways, the Belt and Road Initiative has also been seen as an integral part of China's 13 5-year plan. So talking about the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think in many ways, okay, this could be understood as nothing is a direct expansion of Obama's free balance. In other words, this has nothing fundamental different from Obama's government's his so-called pivoting to Asia strategy. Okay, so I will say the unifying elements of this Indo-Pacific strategy and the so-called establishment of Quad is the so-called China factor. In fact, it's being shared by many scholars, like particularly Indian scholars. This China factor is widely shared among the regional partners. For example, for Australia, Japan, India, and US. So central to the shared vision, perhaps could be understood as the increasing realization of the risk being posed by China. I think as Dr. Stephen Nagy has also rightly pointed out that this Indo-Pacific strategy, I think it is very important for us to understand this so-called US-led rule-based international order is not only supported or endorsed by the so-called Western powers, but as we can see, this is also being shared by a number of regional partners.
Doctor, last minute.
Yes. Okay, sure. Okay, so in terms of understanding this intensifying US-China strategic competition in this context, I think there are four contributing factors which we can try to make sense of. First is the shrinking or narrowing power gap between the two sides since 2008 in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. And some Chinese scholars call this a structural contradiction between a hegemon and the rising power. Okay, second is the mutual perception factor shaping this strategic competition, with US being alarmed by China's expanded global influence, and at the same time, China is not being content with or being happy with just complying with this so-called US-led rule-based international order. Third, the ideological difference between the two sides in terms of the fundamental difference between the political institutions and value systems. And fourth, the emerging competition between the two sides over the international leadership and prestige. And this could be understood as the China's increasing determination of being regarded as co-equal to the US in terms of being the same kind of international leaders like the US. So two final remarks I would like to make is this strategic competition between the two again, if this could be understood as so-called new Cold War, then this is perhaps could be understood as the struggle between two fundamental development models. And my argument here is that this struggle between these two different models would very likely remain in place in this context, the Indo-Pacific Strategy and the BRI. And second, final remark is this confrontational foreign policy making of China and the Xi is very likely to continue, which is being again driven by these assertive nationalist sentiments. And in many ways, the inevitable consequence of this assertiveness of China's foreign policy making is this would further exacerbate the strategic distrust between the US and China, and thereby intensifying this strategic competition between the US and China in the post-COVID-19 world. So thank you very much. This is basically what I would like to share at this moment. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation. And now let's go to our last speaker, Jumel Estranero from the Office of the President and the Lyceum of the Philippines. So 10 Mr. Estranero, 10 minutes.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes,
right?
yes. We could hear you.
I'll try to share my screen first. Wait for a moment.
So after this, the last speaker, all of you will be able to ask questions, and I will ask you to raise the hand. So please raise the hand so I will see, and I will ask each of person who raise the hand on the screen. Okay, so Ms. Estranero.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. First and foremost, I would like to thank the organizer, this international forum, this International Studies Convention 2021, at the same time, our chief moderator, Dr. Jakub, for this wonderful opportunity. So I'll be presenting to you this book of world and strategic warfare in the changing multipolar order, where in the Philippines and some issues like in the Afghanistan, Taliban, Middle East nations, alliances, and the Indo-Pacific dynamics would be tackled. First and foremost, it's a good thing that Dr. Raymond and Dr. Stephen Nagy mentioned a while ago about the strategic competition, not solely limited on the so-called BRI and at the same time Quad. This paper will try to check some of the nuances, okay, that is being highlighted here in my presentation, where in the multipolar and the book of world will be discussed. Other which is the strategic warfare, wherein the contextualization from the West to East would be discussed later, and at the same time, the risk and vulnerability from wars to the current pandemic. Next would be the Afghanistan Taliban crisis in the MENA region as a key factor in the so-called strategic war, and at the same time, the competition going on in the global security and development, and of course the Indo-Pacific dilemma, or the so-called Quad that they keep on pressing on earlier, and the issue on the South China Sea, which have been happening for a lot of years, for a lot of decades, and the multilateralism. Next, of course, would be the analysis and some sort of recommendations and conclusion as part of the way ahead. So this paper would actually try to some sort of explore about the multipolarity and the book of world. We know for a fact that this notion of multipolarity have actually existed, in some sort of status between a political and economic transnationalization, and at the same time, in response to the coming well, it's not necessarily coming, but it's already an emerging global order between China and the United States, and of course, the peripheral powers like Russia and some middle powers, that these are actually resulted to some interplay between multipolarity and bipolarity. And according to this study by Rosekrans, which have been published back in 1966 in a good study in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, there were vignettes of probability between the bipolarity and the multipolarity wherein they have existed in the so-called bimultipolarity. And this resulted not only in that particular era back in the 1960s, but until now, it actually gave a new lens of international trade and investment, where they have created some vacuums for trade, for development, facilitation, architecture, investment, and dynamics. And this some sort of realignment of U.S., European, Chinese grand strategies on one hand, it actually made a trend towards internationalism as an inward-looking politics, and at some point, civil military operations or relations on the other. So this might seem to be an argument that the transnationalization and may undermine the current multilateral institutions, but in the short medium term, it leads to a hybrid and dysfunctional global order where strategic opportunism and the competition is of course more prevalent. And all of us are very much aware of this of the term VUCA. Well, this term actually came from the United States Army War College, and it describes some sort of conditions resulting to the Cold War. So this kind of concept, when states have adopted it, a lot of business and organizations, specifically those industries or those sectors within the industry, made some sort of guides, leadership, and strategy planning. And as this pandemic grows, we see that we have actually created a world that is quite complex, volatile, ambiguous, and uncertain. So this kind of asymmetry between not only states, those supranational states, but also those consequences of actions by states have created two distinct sub-relations. So like what this particular slide shows. In a study of war and strategy in the modern world, so let's talk about the so-called transition from the West to East. Centuries ago, the context of warfare is only in the only highlights on the Western context, but those significant indicators like the targets, the mode of attacks, the critical facilities, the mortality rates, and the defeat of surrender. These are so-called the strategic warfare attack indicators in the West or in Europe, for example, have actually shifted to the East. And in fact, for the past years, we have seen that from West to East, there were eventualities that have actually shaken the warfare strategies of a lot of states and their political symmetries and asymmetries. Okay, so we have the Hong Kong's new security law, the existing or the current crisis in Myanmar, and of course the ever-developing South China Sea disputes, Philippines, Asean, China, Tal, and in fact United Kingdom and Australia have entered some sort of sea line of communication just to at least counter China's acts in the South China Sea. At the same time, in the East China Sea, we also see Japan, in Korea, and of course China having those clashes. And last but not the least, under this Eastern or Asian context, is the water crisis that is happening, in the landlocked areas in the Southeast Asia, like in Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, and in the not only in the Western states, but there are also effects and impacts of the climate change, and of course the energy security conundrum. Now let's talk about the recent vulnerability of this multipolar world and the VUCA world. There's a strong resistance in the multipolarity. For example, in the Eastern Europe, okay, when Russia is situated, we also have Iran, China, and Venezuela/Brazil. But what is quite interesting here is that the US is currently in a pushback against the multipolarity, and it actually prolongs the unipolar moment. That is quite obvious that the COVID-19 that we are confronting right now hinders this particular act by the United States. Next, meanwhile, just like what we were discussing earlier, okay, we have Russia on the other hand. We have the Iran, China. It's like what was discussed by Dr. Raymond about the BRI. We have the Maritime Silk Road, the MSR, and the Latin America. So these are some of the key factors when we see the strong resistance and defiant core action. At the same time, their values have shaken. Okay, and of course we have the current pandemic that has started. Some say in 2019 as the last quarter, but it's this entire impact have been made in the last in the first and second quarter of 2020. Okay, and as you see here, there's a shift. Okay, from India before being on the top, and even China, United States, there were states like even in the coming from the middle powers became at the top of the spheres. So let's go with the Afghanistan and Taliban crisis in the MENA region. Okay, that many people are saying that the consolidation of the forces, which have been publicly acknowledged, okay, in this context, coincides with the U.S. military withdrawal ahead of formal end the military mission in the on August 31, orders from the President Biden. What is quite highlighting here is that the Taliban insurgents are gaining control of more and more territory in Afghanistan, not only Kabul, which United States estimated days ago that it has actually extended to over half of the Afghanistan's district centers. The Taliban are also putting pressure on the outskirts of half of the provincial capitals, trying to isolate them. Now, the most pressing part is this. It has actually impacted a lot of people, most especially the children, and at the same time their loss of confidence in their state or their government. In the Indo-Pacific dilemma, the South China Sea issue and the multilateralism, this Pacific alliance that we are seeing today have actually shifted. Maybe after this Taliban crisis happened, things have changed. And this rival economic blocks. Yeah.
Mr. Asfanao, please, last minute.
Okay, last 3 minutes. And then for the,
1 minute.
Oh, yeah. 1 minute. 1 minute, okay, 1 minute. Now, apart from this, security issues, we have the economic roadblocks from Russia down to the Latin America. Okay, now again we have the issue on Quad, when people are trying to think of their mind whether this particular matrix may strengthen the guarantee of security, not only the security of sea lanes, but also on engaging what is the perfect score in on peace, and of course the South China Sea issue. in the Philippines is part of it, and the some nexus whether the ASEAN has or will continue in this Indo-Pacific on this Quad security and development alignment, although United States have actually failed on that particular premise. So as shown, these are some of the analyses. I do not have to read the entire thing, but the idea of VUCA, the COVID-19 are some sort of indicators that until now we are trying to confront. And at this one, the challenge in the China and the ASEAN shifting, the paradigm shifting, and of course the multilateralism that we hope that this kind of approach will deal with the code of conduct with China. So these are some recommendations that hopefully would be considered by the panel, not only limited in the Indo-Pacific strategy, but hopefully this would lead to some sort of leadership and encompassing health security, and in the public psyche, it would cascade down from what we can boost the confidence, supply chains, and the immediacy of our actions. And last but not the least, the multipolar order has three things that we have to remember. The US manages decline of its primacy, whether US withdrawal from Afghanistan deals blow to Quad security objectives, and last, how kind of relationships that countries will have with another, in general, both in hard, talking about the wars, and of course the soft issues or the COVID-19. So these are some sort of sources, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And then now let's go to the, thank you very much all panelists for a great presentation, your talks. So thank you very much. And I think it was a very good inspiration for our audience, and I hope it will be a lot of questions. So I will ask you now to put questions on chat or raise your hand, so I will be able to see. We have already two questions. The first question from Simante Bharti to Professor Haliżak: what will be the impact of Afghanistan episode in Indo-Pacific region in terms of great power engagement? The question to Professor Haliżak, and the second question from Saroj Kumar to Professor Mahapatra: how India is going to recalibrate its strategy in Indo-Pacific region after the Afghanistan saga. But now also I'm waiting for your question. Please raise the hand if you would like also to ask a question. So now the floor is for audience. And we have already two questions. If any more comments, questions from your side, so please raise the hand or put on chat. So I don't see. So we have these two questions, and maybe I will add the further question to all panelists. If you could make answer in your conclusion, because several panelists talk about convergence of interest, about convergence of especially economic interest, about cooperation, not only conflict. But can you tell, what do you think in next 5 years? Do you think we'll have an institution, a new institution in Indo-Pacific, which will be responsible for security, or still hub and the spokes architecture, mainly bilateral agreements between the United States and its allies will be still the most important element in security architecture. So hub and spoke architecture system in Indo-Pacific will be still the most important, or do you see any alternatives? So we have 3 questions. So let's start from Professor Haliżak, very short, 1 minute and 30 seconds, and later let's go to Professor Chintamani Mahapatra. Okay, Professor.
Thank you very much.
The question is, what will be impact of Afghanistan episode on Indo-Pacific region? First of all, undoubtedly, I'm sure that the direct result will be expressed in declining U.S. credibility. I'd like to remind you that Joe Biden announced its decision unilaterally, not consulting with allies, with European allies and the partners in the Pacific region. This is the expression of the US arrogance. I'd like you to remind you one historical fact. In 1972, when the US President Nixon landed in China, all allies were surprised because US President forgot to inform them that he arranged a trip to Beijing. And this is the repetition of US unilateralism in foreign policy. The second implication, as I said, the Afghanistan case showed the total ineffectiveness of the military force solutions in resolving some international problems. A few speakers talked about the developmental model of development. I think that this is the crucial issue. This is the most important issue, which shows growth, innovation, and trade and investment. And the last remarks: China, since 1979, have not engaged in military operation abroad. China is the only member of Security Council which has not sent its force abroad since 1979. This is the only one great power, and instead of it, China prioritized its aims and means in another way. So these are two ways of international strategy. American one, based on power, and the Chinese one, with the use more subtle aims and means of international strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. And now let's go to Professor Chintamani Mahapatra. And after Professor Mahapatra, I will ask Professor Nagy because he also make reference to the first question. So let's go now to Professor Mahapatra. So it was question about India. What do you think India, how the situation in Afghanistan will impact India's strategy in Indo-Pacific? Professor Mahapatra, screen is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I'll respond to two questions. One is, of course, the one you said just now, whether India is going to recalibrate its Indo-Pacific strategy because of what happened in Afghanistan. And second one is your question about next 5 years, what's going to happen. Very briefly, both of them. Number one, I don't think there is going to be any direct correlation between what just happened in Afghanistan and what may happen in the Indo-Pacific. India's Indo-Pacific strategy is very clear. India is pushing for not a new strategy in the Indo-Pacific, but rather India looks at the whole region to be not an exclusive club of a few countries only, but it should be inclusive, it should be rule-based, it should be open, and this conflict resolution should be through dialogue and discussion rather than any kind of armed intervention. That is India's position. That will continue. And when we try to make a rule-based order in the Indo-Pacific, it is going to be a work in progress. It cannot be done in a day or two. As I said, a lot of uncertainties are around. Pandemic is yet to be over. The real impact of pandemic in the economies of all the major countries, as well as smaller countries in the region, are not clear yet. Things will be much clearer. I feel that next 5 years, many countries, including the major powers, will be more involved in restoring their economic growth rate and achieving new development. So the focus is going to be, the politics is going to be driven by a political economy and not strategy. Having said that, the next point is in next 5 years, assuming that there may be conflict, what are the hotspots? One hotspot that I can see is, of course, the Taiwan Strait. After what China did in Xinjiang, and after what is happening in Tibet right now, and the apprehension about a post-Dalai Lama unrest in Tibet, and the whole world saw what happened to Hong Kong. If China is going to flex its muscle in Taiwan next, of course, it will have a cascading effect. I don't see any big war taking place over Taiwan, but it is certainly going to have an impact on how the regional countries perceive China and its activities. And it is slowly going to have an impact on the relationship with China. The concept of peaceful rise of China is over. Everybody knows that expectation that China would now become part of the mainstream international community. It has not taken place. It has flexed its military muscle after gaining a lot of wealth and power. So that particular thing is going to impact not only on the image of China abroad, but also in the future relationship. Every country would try to reduce its equation with China to an extent where it would not be dependent, and China should not be calling the shots. This is going to happen in next 5 years. And finally, I would say, RCEP has been concluded. CCTPP has been concluded. The Americans are out of both. India is out of both. The future political economic development will also depend on whether the RCEP members and the CCTPP members, of them are in both. How they are going to maintain the relationship and take forward the agreements that they have signed. All these things at the moment are question mark, simply because of the pandemic and the nationalism and lack of trust in one another. So let me conclude again by repeating what I said. Next 5 years will be engulfed by strategic uncertainty and struggle to restore the economies which have been torn by the pandemic. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Mahapatra. And let's go now from Delhi to Tokyo, Professor Nagy. Thank you for your reference you put on chat. So 2 minutes your observation conclude, answering also for this question, and if you may refer also to the question. Okay, please.
Thank you. I want to springboard off Professor Mahapatra's comment about the importance of political economy moving forward in the Indo-Pacific, and link that to the idea of Afghanistan being a barometer for US security commitments in the region. When we compare US commitments to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, even security commitments to the Philippines, the complexity of US bilateral relations go far beyond a security relationship. They have educational exchanges, scientific exchanges, technological exchanges, people-to-people exchanges. And now we have investment in resilient supply chain initiatives, infrastructure connectivity initiatives, joint diplomacy in international institutions. Afghanistan was a one-song band. It was about terrorism. It was about obliterating Al-Qaeda. To say that the United States credibility has been weakened because of it left Afghanistan, it's not borne out in facts. We have to look at the empirical investments the United States and its partners have made in each other to look at the long-term commitment that the United States has to these partners and to these regions. I'm sorry for Afghanistan, what's happened there, but that's the reality. And I think for our Indian friends, they might be thinking, well, what is the credibility of the United States commitment to India? Well, again, we have these commitments to in the forms of Quad in trying to help with vaccine development, in terms of selectively diversifying supply chains through India. All of this goes to Professor Mahapatra's comment about the political economy is going to be the driver of the region. And although the United States is not part of RCEP or the Comprehensive, Progressive and Trans-Pacific Partnership, don't be surprised if we have a TPP 2.0 in which the United States is going to be forming that agreement, and it's going to include Japan and South Korea and all these other countries. The United States is not a trade agreement joiner, it's a trade agreement former. And we saw that with the renegotiated NAFTA, we saw that with the Japan-America mini trade lateral, we saw that with the pressure to update the course and form the course agreement. I'm sorry for Afghanistan, but again, I think it's a very, very poor comparison for the United States' commitment to the Indo-Pacific and its bilateral and multilateral relationships within the region. And I'll stop there, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Nagy. And now I will ask Professor Roberto.
Jakub, Chair, can you give me 30 seconds?
Okay. So, Professor Mahapatra.
I just want to add a footnote. Afghanistan or no Afghanistan, Indo-US relationship is too expansive, too deep, and too large to get affected negatively. The Indo-US strategic partnership, which has seen an upward trajectory in last 20 years, will remain so, both in the Indo-Pacific and in other parts of the world. That is the bottom line. And Afghanistan or Taiwan or even what's going on along the Sino-Indian border, these are different events and issues, no doubt about it, but the fundamental relationship is robust and that is going to remain the same. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I will ask Professor Rabel, Chakrabarti, and Kwun-Sun and Estranero. You have 1 minute to final conclusion because we need to finish. So, Professor Rabel, let's your final words. What do you think hub and spokes architecture system will be still the most important, or you have different perception? Professor Rabel.
First, can I say that I agree with everything that Professor Nagy said, and I agree that we need to put what is happening in Afghanistan in broader perspective. And in that sense, I think the significance of Afghanistan for the Indo-Pacific and what has happened there in the past few days will be seen very differently in a year's time or so. As to the continuation of the hub and spoke, yes, I think with that depth of those relations that, again, Professor Nagy touched on, will continue. And it's difficult to see in the current situation a significant shift in the way that security is managed in the region. And I think the question for the non-greatest powers, countries like New Zealand, Australia, the ASEAN states, is whether or not they can expand what has been built through ASEAN centrality to try and find some way of bridging the relations between like-minded and unlike-minded states. And regional architecture, ASEAN-centered regional architecture, has played a key role in that respect in the Asia-Pacific. And there's a big question whether that's one way of potentially mitigating some of the elements of geopolitical competition. But I agree with some of the other speakers about the looming importance of political economy in the coming years. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Rabel, Professor Shantanu, Chakrabarti. Let's go now to Calcutta. 1 minute.
Essentially, I don't have anything new to add. Just one or two comments, based on what Professor Nagy and Professor Mahapatra had said. Certainly, whether you accept that the American influence, global influence is declining or not, it's not that it's going to suddenly decline and eclipse very suddenly. American involvement is going to be there. But my, to what extent would be the dependence of the Indo-Pacific on the United States? Even if you accept the hub and spoke structure, so long Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, whatever you preferable term, they essentially have been dependent on the United States for security and to broad economic partnership. Now, under Trump, we saw a sort of American first policy, which led to several frictions between United States and its time and trusted allies. Within in European Union, in NATO, for instance, when it started demanding more financial contribution from European partners, and then as a result of which there was a huge sigh of relief when the Trump administration was replaced with the Democrats. But with the Afghanistan, it may not be, in 1 year's time, it may be just a small blip on your entire computer screen, but there is, perceptions are important in international relations. And perception-wise, right now, the US standing is perhaps at an all-time low. And these sort of things stays back in the mind of policymakers and as well as analysts. And I think to my thinking, if you look at the new age strategic challenges which are going to affect the region, which essentially would be a combination of both non-traditional as well as traditional security issues, often emanating from particular regions, but because of long-term historical connectivity within the region itself, these often would be spilling over to different areas. And these are security issues which cannot really be, there are no immediate military solutions to these issues. Where we are talking a lot about Afghanistan today. Afghanistan, Professor Nagy is correct. It's an old problem, and this sort of a military solution was never going to settle the question. You perhaps need more out-of-the-box thinking. As a result of which, my idea, as a result of which, in the coming decades, my fear is within the Indo-Pacific zone. Certainly, there are going to be attempts. US might try to make a comeback by trying to forge new economic partnerships, etc. But my fear is, one, that that the overall perception of United States intentions, whether there is a regime change again, whether the Republicans come back to power, etc., to what extent that sort of low perception and fear of United States actual intent, or it's this is the Afghanistan is going to be seen as this great betrayal.
Okay, Professor, we need to finish. So last sentence, Professor.
From me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, if that's my first fear, the second point is that in the coming decades, you will see such closer integration between non-traditional and traditional security issues that you would require new type of solutions in all the states. And I think instead of external superpowers, perhaps it would be better for the regional players and the local players themselves to come out with some sort of shared solution, and that is already being tried out. One traditional age-old Asian policy has been never to put all eggs in one basket, and that's what all the Asian
Thank you very much, Shantanu. And now very shortly, 45 seconds, Professor Kwun-Sun very shortly, and later Sanaha also 45 seconds. So let's go to Raymond.
Okay, thank you, Professor Jakub. Okay, so in terms of understanding this strategic competition between the US and China in this so-called post-COVID-19 world, I would say, okay, this competition between these two great powers would somewhat become inevitable, mainly because first, this narrowing power gap between the two countries. Okay, second is this growing assertiveness of the China's foreign policy making under Xi Jinping, which I argue will remain in place. And whether US or the China will emerge as this so-called winner in this strategic competition, I think it hangs on whether either US or China can make the regional partners endorsing, okay, this either is a BRI vision or this FOIB vision. But it seems to me, I tend to agree with largely, okay, Dr. Nagy's concerns. His remarks, right? Money can't buy love, right? Because in a sense, China doesn't actually have true friends, a reliable ally in the region. Okay, but anyway, yeah, that's basically what I would like to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last sentence, 45 seconds.
No, is that for me?
Yes.
Yeah. First and foremost, I have to agree with Sir Stephen Nagy, because as a Filipino, I have seen the micropolitics here in the Philippines, and from the past 5 years of President Duterte, and I believe that you are quite aware that President Duterte is quite adamant against United States administration, okay? Not only with Trump but also with Biden. But just this year, there was a renewal. Okay, just have to highlight that renewal of the visiting forces agreement between the Philippines and the United States. So in other words, there is always an ever-changing micropolitics inside the mind of any political leaders, which we may not seem to see from the past few years. And I also would like to agree with Dr. Raymond was saying earlier about the regional partnership. Okay, the case of Afghanistan is not necessarily the entire thing. Okay, the United States assistance to the Afghanistan, for example, for the past years, their aids, for example, or the financial aids, whether these are gratis or not, then these are unconditional things that they've given not only for the reorientation of troops in the strategic territory in Kabul, but of course to defend the infrastructure of the Afghanistan. So I believe that that is not necessarily a strategic competition just to topple down a lot of perceptions and public beliefs, but also to at least believe some sort of confidence. However, of course, people would think that the U.S. withdrawal may seem to be a hindrance for other states to at least castigate United States to be a sole guarantor of security in the Quad or the Indo-Pacific. But of course, it has to be communicated well by the Biden administration, okay, to at least solve those G3 and these G3 statements, and understandably so over the past week that we have seen that that the Taliban has overtaken some districts in the.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Sanaho. Sorry to interrupt, but we needed to finish because we crossed 8 minutes already time, and the next panel will start now. So I would like to thank all panelists for great presentation, for great discussion, and as you see, we touch a lot of things, and we would discuss probably more and more. But I have very good news for you, because on the 24th September at noon Polish time, 12 o'clock p.m. Polish time, 24 September, it is Friday. We are going to have a panel during Asian Congress organized also by our faculty, with Professor Stephen Nagy, with Professor Roberto Rabel, with Professor Shantanu Chakrabarti, Professor Haliżak. So a lot of issues which we started today to discuss. I hope we will continue and will have very, very fruitful again discussion 24 September. So please visit our website of the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies, University of Warsaw. You will find in 2 weeks information with link about this panel. Once again, I would like to thank all panelists. I would like to thank our audience to take part in discussion, and of course I would like to thank you very much, organizer, for possibility to have this panel, and I would like to wish you very, very nice day, and thank you very much, and goodbye, and see you soon. Bye bye. Thank you very much.
Everyone, thank you. Good
Thanks so
health.
much, sir. Thanks so much.